The bloodthirsty chupacabra has been sighted in the new Diabolical Desert structure deck for my card game Cryptid Fates. Go to cryptidcardgame.com to pre-order now, use the online deck builder, or join the community at reddit.com/r/cryptidccg. Werewolves, Bigfoot, skinwalkers, and wendigos? Pfft, get that out of here. Today we delve into some lesser known or even never before heard of monsters. Welcome back to Unexplained Encounters. I'm your host, Darkness Prevails. And do me a favor and consider getting some of my wife's adorable bearded dragon and bunny stickers she made over at ruffledragons.com/shop. They're cheap and cute and just in time for Christmas. If you have some scary stories of the unexplained, go to darkstories.org to send them to us. If you're on Spotify or Apple Podcasts, leave Unexplained Encounters a rating and a follow, because it'll make you like a super cool person. If you're on YouTube, you'd better like this video or no warm milk for you tonight. Now, let's begin. That is not my cat. From Ash. During the past few months, the paranormal activity surrounding me has increased. This is one of the encounters I've experienced. It began about 2 weeks ago, as of writing this. To start, I have 2 cats. One is named Merlin, and can't go outside for his own safety. The other is Smokey, and he loves to go outside. For the past few days, Smokey had been avoiding doors and windows, and was refusing to go outside, which is very odd behavior for him. Merlin was looking outside constantly, and seemed as if he was tracking something no one else could see. I didn't think much of it, as I had just finished university for the year, so I was home a lot more often, and thought they were just acting odd as they were not used to me being home so frequently. The experience began at around midday. I was home alone and Smokey began to scratch at the door, indicating he needed to go outside. I let him out quickly, happy that he was finally going back to his normal behavior. As soon as I let him out, my other cat, Merlin, began hissing at the door, his tail going straight up and bushy, as if he was scared of something. I was worried, so I picked him up and gave him cuddles, and he curled up on my lap and fell asleep. A few hours later, I heard meowing at the door. I looked over and there was Smokey, wanting to come back in. His meows sounded strained, and almost like he had never spoken them before. Merlin woke up then, and went right over to the door, hissing at Smokey, beginning to try to make himself look bigger, going into an aggressive state. He stared at Smokey through the glass door. I picked up Merlin and began to open the door for Smokey, but Merlin went crazy. He started to bite and scratch at me, so I wasn't able to open the door. I placed him back onto the ground, really confused and somewhat freaked out by his behavior. I looked back over at Smokey through the glass. He was still meowing in the strained voice. It was at that moment I realized something was off about him. His head was slightly larger, and eyes were too close together. He had a black mark on his tail which had never been there before. He looked up at me, and instead of green eyes, I saw pure black eyes. I locked eyes with it, and felt as if it were staring right into my soul. This creature was not my cat. I shut the blinds and sat down, a cold chill running down my spine. It was only a few minutes after that when I heard my doorbell ring. My neighbors were there holding Smokey, the actual Smokey. They said that he had been scratching at their door as if his life depended on it, and as soon as they opened the door, he ran inside and hid. It took them a while to get him to come out, then they took him back over to me. Luckily, they have cats of their own and love my 2 cats, so didn't mind. They just wanted Smokey to be safe. That night, as I was trying to sleep, both of my cats curled up beside me and went to sleep. I wasn't so lucky. There was no way I could fall asleep that night. In the early hours of the morning, both my cats woke up and ran out of my room. Confused, I called out to them to see if they would come back, but instead of them responding, I heard a strained meow from outside the window my bed was up against. The window was cracked open, and my blinds were not fully closed. It was a full moon night, so I could see the outline of a cat on the roof beside my window. I saw two eyes. They were darker than the night surrounding it, and they were staring at me. I knew it was the same thing that I'd seen earlier. This creature began to walk over to my slightly opened window, which instinct took over then, and I shut it quickly, despite my state of being nearly paralyzed in fear. I couldn't take my eyes off this thing, as it watched me, almost taunting. It began to screech, a screech that sounded identical to that of a female kiwi bird. I've attached a link to a video of a kiwi screech at the bottom of this, for those who don't know how they sound. Editor's note, I'll play that sound now for you. One thing about the kiwis that their calls are sexually dimorphic. A male's call sounds like a typical bird, while a female's is, obviously, pure nightmare fuel, if you don't expect it. There were no reported kiwis in my area of the country, since before European settlement, which was around 200 years ago. It disappeared shortly after letting out the screech, and my cats returned to my bed. The following few days, I didn't see this creature, but I would hear it screech at around 3 a.m. almost every night, like clockwork, for the following week. I went away for one night, and since then it has stopped. I haven't seen or heard the creature again, and my cats have returned to their normal behavior. This serves as a great reminder that the creatures we call our pets can be very knowledgeable, more than we give them credit for, and sometimes they know things that we don't. I have no idea what would have happened if I'd opened my door for that creature. Merlin probably saved my life that day, and I'll be forever grateful. Both my cats have been getting spoiled over the past few weeks, which is the least they deserve. Friend and I witness a dragon flying. From Drako. My friends and I live in the north of the UK. England, not Scotland, to be more precise, near the peaks and Pennines. The first encounter I have is an experience that happened to me and a friend in which we saw these creatures flying around at night. The first encounter I can remember happened on a summer night in June 2021. While taking a night walk, I spotted this giant flying black creature. Though the encounter lasted only 3 seconds, as this being was flying very fast, I managed to capture some details in that brief moment. It was jet black, with bat-like wings and a long body. It had a black reptilian head that seemed to be looking around for something. I was only able to make out these details as I saw it fly over a streetlight. Strangely, the streetlight did not illuminate the creature, even though it flew directly overhead. The wingspan was enormous. With wings outstretched, it would have been the size of a semi-truck. I only saw it flap its wings once. For the rest of the duration, it simply glided as it flew over me. The second sighting happened just about a month ago, when my friend and I observed something with a massive wingspan high up in the clouds. We only saw one wing of it, but again, it was black and bat-like in nature. When I described what I saw to my friends, they told me they'd heard previous accounts of what could only be described as dragons being sighted in the mountainous regions of northern England. I've also read about others encountering dragons in the peaks, the Pennines, and Snowdonia, Wales, where there are caves cut off from civilization. They didn't breathe fire, though. I've shared these stories with several of my friends, and they seem to believe me. While most people will tell you that dragons are only part of myth and legend, I can personally confirm that these creatures are very real. Since my last sighting, I haven't seen any more dragons, but I do look forward to future encounters. I keep my eyes focused on the night sky these days. When I described to my friend exactly what I saw during our shared experience, he confirmed seeing the same thing, a giant bat-like wing silhouetted against the bright moonlit sky. We couldn't make out any other features due to cloud cover, though I wish we could have seen more of the creature. My Mom and the Lizard Man, from Silver Bullet54. My mom lived in North Carolina from the time I was 11 until 2020, when she passed from heart failure. Though I hadn't seen her since I was 10, I knew she never believed in monsters or ghosts or other supernatural subjects, dismissing them all as fiction or imagination. But after an unexpected encounter she had in 2017, near Camp Lejeune, North Carolina, something tells me she likely changed her mind. If you've lived in the southern or southeastern United States, you've likely heard of the Lizard Man. This creature has reportedly been traipsing around that region for over a century, with many people claiming to have seen it, or at least have seen evidence of its existence. The year 2014 seemed to be particularly active for the Lizard Man, with numerous reports of gouges, scratch marks, apparent teeth marks, and other property damage caused by something that appeared to be very big and very angry. My mom wasn't unscathed. Half of her fence that separated her mother's house where she lived from the nearby apartment complex was ripped apart and thrown about. Though my mom initially suspected vandals, my grandmother pointed out that theirs was only one of 3 houses on the entire block. They kept to themselves, and no human vandal could have done such damage to a steel fence. My mom still thought it was just someone playing a joke, but she soon learned otherwise. A week later, my mom was coming home from work around 11 p.m. Despite the pitch-black night, the full moon provided enough light to see clearly. As she approached a T intersection, she spotted what looked like someone lying in the road and thought they might be in trouble. She slowed down, lowering her window and asking if they needed help. The figure jumped as if startled and stood up. My mom estimated it to be at least 8 feet tall, and that's at least. It glared at her with piercing red eyes and opened its mouth to reveal jagged teeth that shone white in her car's high beams. She flashed her beams a few times to confuse it, then tore off in the other direction. In her rearview mirror, she saw the creature chasing after her. Despite speeding up, it stayed on her tail. She turned into a diner's parking lot and ran inside to hide. When a patron saw her white face, he asked what had happened, and she breathlessly told her story. He nodded, picked up a rifle he had with him, walked outside, and looked around. After a few moments, he returned to say that whatever it was had vanished. The next night, while my mother was taking a walk, she heard a hissing sound right behind her. Having heard that when facing a monster behind you, you should never turn to look, she just instead walked calmly down the road until the hissing grew fainter. Even so, she was terrified, knowing this meant the creature had remembered her and knew who she was. When she got back home, she was shocked to find 3 of her SUV's windows broken, a mirror nearly ripped off, and deep gouges on the front hood. There were webbed footprints surrounding the house and cars. Inside, she found her grandmother talking to 2 police officers. It turned out many people had also seen the Lizard Man, and authorities wanted to ensure this wasn't a case of mass hysteria. However, my mother's and grandmother's descriptions matched almost exactly what others had reported. My mother never saw the creature again before she died, but reports still trickle in from places like Miami, Baton Rouge, Raleigh, Savannah, and even Waco. Is the Lizard Man real? Was it all just pranks by locals? I honestly can't say for sure in any case, because I wasn't there, and I've never seen him myself. Perhaps there's a giant reptilian creature skulking around in both sparsely and heavily populated areas of the subtropical US. And if that is the case, I hope you all stay safe. In the Desert, from Blood Moon One Dragon. True story that took place in 2020. Me and my family went on a trip to Colorado Springs. I can't remember exactly where we went in Colorado Springs, but I do know we went to a desert on a little vacation activity. The desert wasn't as hot as I thought it would be. Surprisingly, I could probably survive out there for a few days if I had to. It was quite a long drive. I was about 9 years old at the time, so I was in the seat just sleeping. At one point, my parents woke me up, and to my surprise, there was a desert outside. I asked my mother why we were here, and she said that we were going to look at dinosaur fossilized tracks. I didn't want to complain. We walked into the path leading to a bridge made of sand. My grandfather was teasing me about rattlesnakes, saying that they'll jump and fly at me. That's when I started to get worried. At that point, we were walking across this bridge made of sand. It was about 25 to 20 feet tall. I was walking close behind my family when I paused in my tracks to look at the view. Eventually, I began to look down, and in horror, I saw this 7-foot-tall humanoid creature. Its skin was as pale as the sand. It seemed as if it was trying to blend into its surroundings. It had a hunched back. It also looked like it hadn't eaten in days. I could see its spine poking out. It walked slowly and quietly. It didn't even seem to notice us. It looked as if it was being drawn to something. I stood there watching it slowly walk 1 foot at a time. My eyes were wide, and what I saw really woke me up. I turned to see that my family were already almost at the end of the bridge. I ran over to catch up. Throughout the whole time, I couldn't stop thinking about what I saw. Of course, I was a child at the time, so I didn't really know how to react, or if I should even tell anyone. I tried to keep my mind on the dinosaur fossils, and I bet my parents were curious as to why I wasn't so fascinated by science. They knew I usually loved science, and anything rocks or fossil. I couldn't even enjoy this, because I was too focused on my sighting and trying to process what to do next. I was born with slow processing, so of course, at such a young age, you wouldn't really expect someone to see something strange like that. Now I'm older, and I've now figured out it was probably some kind of mythical creature. And from this day on, I'll never forget that incident. Allow me to describe the creature a bit more. As I said, it was 7 feet tall. It had this hunched back with its spine poking out. It didn't have long quills, but it did have long arms that almost touched the ground with long, scary claws. Its back legs were somewhat like a human, and somewhat like a dog too at the same time. Its skin color was as pale as the sand, but a little whiter. It walked at a good speed, swinging its arms in the opposite direction of its legs, just like how a person would walk. It had straight up direct attention of where it was going, and didn't even bother to look over at us. I don't think it had ears, which was the strange part. I couldn't really see its face, so I didn't know if it had a nose or not, or what its eyes even looked like. As a side note, I was trying to think of an explanation for what I saw, and was hoping that my mind was simply playing tricks on me. I was thinking that I probably got too much sun, but I realized that we literally just got out of the car, and it would take a while for the sun to get to me. Plus, the sun usually never got to me, never even got a sunburn before. And my mind was thinking the same way if you were seeing an animal for the first time in the wild. So readers or listeners, if you have any ideas to what I saw, please tell me, and I'll look into it to see if it's a perfect match. I think the Ozark Howler is real. From Cherry Williams. I've lived in Arkansas my whole life, and the Ozark Mountains have always felt like a second home. Last spring, my family decided to take a camping trip deep into the Ozarks, near a spot by the Buffalo River. It was me, my younger brother Ethan, our parents, and our dog Max. We arrived on a Friday afternoon. The campsite was tucked away off a dirt road, far from any main trails or other campers. Dad wanted us to have a true wilderness experience, after all. The first day was perfect. Clear skies, warm weather, we set up tents, gathered firewood, and spent the evening roasting marshmallows under the stars. The first night was uneventful, aside from the usual sounds of the woods, like crickets and owls, but nothing out of the ordinary. Max seemed relaxed, curling up by the fire before we all turned in. The next morning, I decided to explore the area, while Mom and Dad prepared breakfast. Ethan tagged along, and of course, Max led the way. We wandered not too far from camp, just enjoying the scenery. About half a mile out, Max started to act strangely. He stopped abruptly, ears perked up, staring right into the woods. "What's up, boy?" I asked, but Max didn't budge. Ethan threw a stick, trying to get him to play with it, but Max surprisingly ignored it. Then we noticed the trees. Several of them had deep claw marks, higher than a bear could reach, or so we thought. The marks were long and parallel, as if something with massive claws had swiped at them. Ethan pointed out that the bark was freshly torn and asked if I thought it could be a cougar. I told him maybe, though the marks were a bit thick for a cougar. I felt a slight unease but didn't mention it. We then headed back to camp. Over breakfast, we told Dad about the claw marks. He raised an eyebrow but didn't seem too concerned about it. "Could be a black bear," he said. "They can stand on their hind legs and scratch pretty high." "Yeah, I guess," I replied, though I wasn't sure I believed him. That afternoon, we went fishing by the river. The day passed pleasantly, and we returned to camp as the sun began to set. As we cooked dinner over the fire, the forest around us grew quieter, and at a certain point, it was a bit too quiet. "Do you hear how quiet it is?" Mom asked. "Completely silent," Dad said. Max was getting restless, pacing around the perimeter of our campsite, occasionally letting out a low growl. After dinner, we sat around the fire, trying to shake off the weird vibe. Ethan wanted to tell ghost stories, but Mom vetoed his idea. "Let's keep things light tonight," she said, with a seemingly forced smile. Around 10 p.m., we heard it, a distant howl that echoed through the trees. It was a deep and haunting sound, unrecognizable compared to other animals I'd heard before. We all looked at each other, and then Ethan whispered, "What do you think it was?" Dad poked at the fire, telling us it was a coyote, but not sounding convinced himself this time. The howl came again, and I swear it sounded closer. Max stood stiff. I could see his fur bristling. He growled then, and that really made me nervous. "Maybe we should turn in for the night." Mom started to get up. We agreed, and Dad stoked the fire a bit higher, hoping it might deter any wildlife that was approaching. We retreated to our tents, Ethan and I in one, our parents in another. Max insisted on staying outside, positioning himself right at the entrance of our tent, like a guard dog. It was hard for me to sleep that night, but sometime after midnight I was jolted completely awake when Max began to bark like crazy. Ethan jolted up too. "What's going on?" he mumbled. I unzipped the tent flap slightly to peer outside. The fire had died down to an orange glow. Max was facing the woods, barking non-stop. And then I saw something. Just beyond the tree line, 2 glowing red eyes staring at us. I froze, never feeling so scared before. The creature stepped forward a bit, enough for me to make out its silhouette. It was massive, looking more like a large cat, but much, much bulkier, and I swear there were horns coming from its head. "Ethan," I said, in a whisper, "look at that." He leaned over to see. "What is that?" he gasped. I didn't have an answer for him. The creature howled then, and with how close it was so loud it seemed to vibrate the very air around us. Our parents then burst from their tent. Dad basically screamed at us. "Get in here!" He grabbed a flashlight and shone it toward the creature, while beckoning us towards his tent. The creature didn't retreat. It just stood there, silently watching us now. Mom pulled us inside their tent. "What is that thing?" she asked, voice shaking. "I don't know," Dad said, "but we need to stay calm." Max kept barking, but he didn't approach the thing. He seemed as scared as we were. For a long time, we sat there huddled together, just listening. We could hear the creature beginning to circle the campsite, heavy footsteps crunching leaves and snapping twigs. Occasionally, we would catch glimpses of its eyes through the tent fabric. Then, just as suddenly as it started, it all stopped. We waited, hardly daring to breathe. After several minutes, Dad peered outside. I was so scared and nervous, but eventually he pulled himself back in and said, "I think it's gone." "Are you sure?" Mom asked. "Stay here." He stepped out, cautiously, scanning the entire perimeter with the flashlight. Max stayed close to him, still alert, but no longer growling, which I thought was a good sign. Dad eventually came back, poking his head past the tent flaps. "Looks clear." We spent the rest of the night inside the tent, too scared to sleep. At first light, we began packing up. None of us wanted to spend another night out here. As we loaded the car, a park ranger drove up, probably making his rounds. He got out and approached us. "Morning, folks," he said. "Everything all right?" Dad was honest right away. "Not exactly. We had some kind of, animal stalking our camp last night." The ranger explained that he had heard reports of bear activity in the area. But I had to blurt out, "This wasn't a bear. It had horns and glowing red eyes." The ranger's expression remained neutral. Sometimes when we're scared, our mind can play tricks. "I'm telling you we all saw it," Ethan insisted, backing me up. The ranger smiled. "It's best to be cautious. You folks stick to the main campsites next time, okay?" As he walked back to his vehicle, I couldn't help but feel irritated, frustrated even, that he didn't even give our story a chance to be believed. On the drive home, we were all quiet for a while. Eventually, Mom said, "Do you think it was what do they call it?" She was trying to keep her voice down, talking only to Dad. "The, Ozark Howler." "I've heard stories." My dad's voice was low, too. Thought it was just a legend, to be honest. When we got home, I did some research. The descriptions did match what we saw. The Ozark Howler, a large horned creature with glowing red eyes. Sightings were rare, but not unheard of. To this day, I'm freaked out that we saw something like that. Some sort of strange and bulky cryptid that could have ripped us all to pieces if it desired to. We've been camping since then, but even so, Max refuses to go near the woods. He's an old dog now, but hates anything with trees. Face to Face with Black Shuck, from Anonymous. It was late one foggy evening. I was returning home after visiting a friend, driving through the winding roads of East Anglia. The countryside was cloaked in mist at the time. The headlights of my car did very little to help with that. The radio signal had faded miles back, too, leaving me alone with the hum of the engine and the rhythmic swishing of the windshield wipers. As I navigated a particularly narrow stretch of road bordered by thick woods, a dark shape darted out in front of me. Without even thinking, I slammed on the brakes, and the tires began to skid on the wet pavement. The car came to a halt mere feet from where the figure stood. My heart was pounding right out of my chest. I squinted through the windshield, and outside, I saw a large black dog, illuminated by my headlights. I had never seen a dog quite like that before. It was big, with shaggy fur and eyes that glowed a deep, unsettling red. It stood motionless and was watching me. For a moment, neither of us moved, but I had the worst, most creepy feeling about the whole thing. The legends of the Black Shuck, a ghostly hound said to roam these parts, came flooding back into my mind from childhood. Gathering my wits, I honked the horn lightly, hoping to scare the thing away. But the dog didn't even flinch. Instead, it actually took a slow step towards my car. Fear tightened my throat. Just as I was about to reverse, the creature turned its head sharply to the right, as if something had caught its attention, and then vanished into the fog. I sat there gripping the steering wheel like it was a lifeline. After a few deep breaths, I decided to continue on the road, easing my foot onto the accelerator. I drove slowly, though, feeling freaked out and not wanting to get scared again. Not even a mile down the road, I noticed something was wrong. The fog was thickening up, and the road ahead looked distorted. I slowed down even more, and then I saw something else. The road had collapsed up ahead in a large section, the asphalt crumbling into a muddy ditch below. The recent heavy rains must have caused a landslide, and if I hadn't been driving slowly, I might have gone straight into it. A deep chill hit me as I realized the gravity of the situation. I pulled over to the side, my hands now shaking. Was that really Black Shuck I saw? And had he warned me of this danger that could have killed me? I gathered myself, and I turned the car around carefully, heading back the way I came. I knew there was a small village pub not too far back. Perhaps I could report the road collapse there, keeping other people safe. After ensuring the authorities were notified about the road, I stayed the night at a nearby inn, hoping to let the weather calm down. Since that night, I always drive a little more carefully, and I pay attention to the signs, both the literal and the unseen, if that makes sense. And whenever I share my story with people, I honor the Black Shuck not as a harbinger of doom, but perhaps as a guardian of the lonely roads, watching over travelers like me in the quiet fog of East Anglia. Have you heard of the Glimmer Man? From Silent Asylum. Longtime hunter of the forests of Washington State here. Autumn of 2019, I had decided to explore a section of the woods I'd never ventured into before. Some friends of mine said the game there was abundant, and it sounded too good to pass up. Looking back, I probably should have brought someone with me. But you know how it is when you've been doing something for so long. You get overconfident. I headed out early, around 6 a.m. I think. During the first few hours, I found some deer tracks, but nothing special. By around noonish, though, something did feel off. What I'm gonna say here is gonna sound cliché, but coming from a hunter who never experiences this on his outings, it definitely means something. But I began to feel watched. I figured maybe a distant scavenger or predator was watching me, but nothing to be worried about, nothing that wouldn't be scared of humans. But the weird part was, when all the birds, and just the birds, suddenly stopped singing, and I mean all at once. The insects didn't seem to mind, but the birds had been in an uproar all day, until now. That's when I saw something weird, and it's very hard to describe, but I'll do my best. There was something that looked like heat waves, like what you see coming off the road in the summer. This weird distortion of light and space between the trees. I remember rubbing my eyes, thinking I was tired or maybe I had something in them. When I looked again, it was gone. Then, the next time I checked my compass, it had stopped working. I have had this compass for years, and it had never failed me or freaked out. But the needle just kept spinning. I wasn't too worried at first, because I could see the sun still, and I had my bearings. But clouds were starting to roll in. The more that appeared, the more I began to feel turned around. Worse yet, I kept seeing that heat wave-like figure in my peripheral vision. Every time I turned to look directly at it, there was nothing. By this point, it was getting dark, and it was starting to rain. I didn't pack any rain gear, because the forecast before I left was clear. There was no cell service out there either. I'll admit it, I was starting to panic a bit. Then I saw it clearly. Well, sort of clearly. It was like, you know when you're underwater and you look up at someone standing above the pool? That kind of wavery, distorted human shape. It was just standing there between two pine trees. My first instinct was to raise my rifle, but something stopped me. Can't explain it, but it didn't feel threatening. And here's the stranger part. I followed it. I know it sounds like a dumb move, following something unexplained and possibly dangerous into the woods. But I felt something inside, like something was pulling me to it, a sort of guidance. I followed the heat wave-like figure from the distance. It was very difficult to keep track of it, but I was able to, until we made it to a cabin, an old cabin. And it seemed as if when the cabin appeared, I finally completely lost track of the figure. The cabin itself seemed abandoned, but dry. I waited out the storm in there. Over the night, I saw the figure one more time through the window, and I swear, I think it nodded at me. But maybe I imagined that part. By morning, the storm had cleared, and I could see a nearby peak. I used that to find my way back. Months after this experience, I stopped at a diner I frequent. They've got the best coffee around. I ended up making conversation with the guy at the counter, an older man, which after a couple of minutes led into my experience with the heat wave figure. I figured he'd be in disbelief or laugh at the story, but instead that I'd seen the Glimmer Man. Apparently, other people have seen similar things in the woods, and the circumstances around the sighting are often the same. When someone is lost, the Glimmer Man might lead them to safety, if they trust its guidance. I've been back in those woods plenty of times since then. I found the cabin again too, still run down and old. I left some supplies in there in case someone else got lost, like I did. But regarding the Glimmer Man, I never did see him again. Never had that strange being watched feeling either out in the woods. So maybe that's what I was feeling. The barely seeable Glimmer Man in the distance, watching me. The Gargoyle. From Lloyd. I grew up in New York City. I lived with my parents in this old apartment building on the Upper West Side. It was one of those grand pre-war structures, all ornate stonework and towering spires. The exterior was adorned with these Gothic gargoyles too. Their stone faces really creeped me out, frozen with menacing snarls. Inside, the building was all polished marble and brass fittings, a completely different vibe to the exterior and the figures that clung to it. My room was on the 10th floor, and from my window I had a clear view of one gargoyle in particular. It was perched just a few feet away, its wings folded, claws gripping the ledge as if ready to pounce. By day it was merely unsettling, but by night, the dark and shadows distorted its features, and it became the stuff of nightmares for little me. But what I didn't know yet was that it would get much worse. I was 8 years old when the first incident happened. I'd come down with a nasty case of the flu. Fever, chills, the whole ordeal. That night, I woke up drenched in sweat. The room was stifling despite the winter chill outside. I was groggy and disoriented, and I realized then that my window was open, with the curtains billowing softly from the breeze. I was confused, but then I was scared, as I recalled that we always kept the windows locked, especially in my room. I sat up then, intending to go close the window, but that's when I noticed something that made my blood run cold. The gargoyle that usually loomed outside my window was gone. I stared at the empty ledge, hoping my fever was playing tricks on me. But then a scraping sound broke the silence, a slow and deliberate dragging noise across the wooden floor. It was coming from inside my room. My heart pounded so loudly, I was sure it was going to wake my parents. I pulled the blanket over my head, squeezing my eyes shut, trying to tell myself it was all in my mind. The scraping got closer, each scratch echoing in the dark. But then it stopped, right at the foot of my bed. I could feel its presence. Something was watching me. Minutes felt like hours, and eventually the room grew quiet again, except for the rustling of the curtains. Mustering every ounce of courage, I lowered the blanket, just enough to peek out. Somehow the window was now closed, the curtains drawn tight. My room appeared as it should. No shadows lurking, no figure standing over me. I told myself it really was a fever dream, some hallucination brought on by illness. But I had to be sure. I had to see that gargoyle back where it was supposed to be to put my mind at ease and get some sleep. Slipping out of bed quietly, I tiptoed toward the window. I swallowed hard as I parted the curtains. The ledge was still empty. I panicked then, spinning around and scanning my room. It didn't take long for me to find it. In the corner perched atop my dresser was that gargoyle, stone eyes seeming to gleam, fixed directly on me. Its wings were partially unfurled, and one clawed hand reached forward, as if ready to grab. A strangled scream escaped my throat. I bolted from the room, the hallway spinning as I raced to my parents' bedroom, crying for Mom and Dad. I pounded on their door. They jolted awake, alarmed by my hysterics. Between sobs, I tried to explain what I'd seen. My father grabbed a baseball bat from under his bed, a relic from his old college days, and led the way back to my room. My mother followed close behind, her hand on my shoulder. When we entered, the window was wide open again, curtains fluttering gently. But that gargoyle was back on the ledge, as immovable as ever. My father checked every corner, every closet, even under the bed. There was nothing unusual, no signs of an intruder. "You must have had a bad dream, honey," my mother said softly and patiently, smoothing my hair. "But the window," I protested. "But nothing. The latch was probably loose, son," my father said. "I'll have maintenance take a look tomorrow. For now, let's get you back to bed." I didn't argue any further. I knew they wouldn't believe me, and part of me wanted to accept it really was just a nightmare. They tucked me in, assuring me everything was fine, and left the door slightly ajar as they returned to their room. When I knew they were gone, I got out of bed again. I didn't go to the window. I went to my dresser, and I looked at the top. I could barely breathe when I saw scratch marks that had never been there before, like something had quickly jumped down from it. Over the next few months, I avoided my room whenever possible. I would make excuses to stay in the living room, or linger in my parents' company. They thought it was a phase, perhaps lingering anxiety from the fever episode. I didn't dare tell them I still felt watched whenever I was alone in that room. One evening, a thunderstorm rolled in, the kind that rattles windows and turns the sky an ominous gray. My parents were hosting this dinner party, and I was expected to stay in my room so as to not disturb the guests. Reluctantly, I retreated upstairs. I tried to lose myself in a book, but the howling wind and distant rumble of thunder made it impossible to concentrate. Restless, I wandered over to the window. Rain was streaking across the glass. There were flashes of lightning all over the sky. Suddenly, a small pigeon flew out of the rain and perched itself on the windowsill, obviously seeking shelter from the storm. It looked bedraggled, feathers ruffled and eyes blinking against the rain. Compassion outweighed my fear for a moment. I pressed my hand against the glass, as if to offer some comfort as I watched. It pecked here and there, turning to face me a couple of times as if curious whether or not I was a danger. Eventually it felt comfortable and got all cozy, sitting on the ledge. I yawned and just kept watching the bird and the storm. There was really nothing else to do. Suddenly, a blur of motion caught my eye. The gargoyle. It moved. There was no mistaking it this time. It lunged with startling speed, snatching up the pigeon in stone jaws. That bird never stood a chance. Didn't even have time to react. There was a small patter of blood against the window, masked by the sound of the rain. Feathers drifted downward, clinging to the wet stone. I stumbled backward, startled, and knocked over a lamp. The crash brought tears to my eyes, but I couldn't tear my gaze from the scene outside. The gargoyle resumed its usual pose, the only difference being the dark stain near its mouth. I didn't bother screaming this time. I ran into the dining room, interrupting the dinner party without a second thought. "Dad, please, you have to come now," I begged, ignoring the bewildered looks from the guests. My father saw panic in my eyes. He apologized to the table, excusing himself and following me upstairs. When we reached my room, the gargoyle appeared as it always did, stoic, unmovable. But there was evidence this time. Blood smeared on the stone, feathers stuck to the windowsill. My father frowned, opening the window to get a closer look. "That's strange," he muttered. "A bird must have hit the window." "No, Dad," I insisted. "It wasn't an accident. The gargoyle, it moved. It ate the pigeon." He looked back at me, concerned. "Listen, son, I know these statues can be a bit intimidating, but they're just made of stone. They can't move." He reached out with an arm and tapped the gargoyle's face to prove it to me. Though brief, the entire time he did that, I was horrified that the thing would come to life and kill my dad. But it didn't happen, thankfully. He was trying to reassure me, but his eyes betrayed a hint of uncertainty. "Maybe we can ask the building manager if the gargoyles have any, mechanical features. But for now, let's clean this up." He fetched some paper towels and disinfectant, wiping up the mess outside. I stood there feeling helpless and increasingly isolated. No one believed me, and the creature right outside my window basically had me cornered. After that night, I refused to sleep in my room. My parents, perhaps feeling guilty or just wanting to keep the peace, allowed me to set up a makeshift bed in the living room. I felt safer there, surrounded by the familiar comforts of my family. A few weeks later, my father announced we'd be moving to a new house in the suburbs. "It's more space. You'll have a big backyard to play in," he explained. I wondered if they sensed my paranoia, if maybe they believed me more than they let on. Regardless, I was so relieved. On our last day in the apartment, I ventured into my old room one final time. The furniture was gone, the walls were bare. The window stood open, letting in a nice cool breeze. I approached it cautiously, peering out at that old gargoyle. It seemed unchanged, yet I knew it was aware of me. I'd seen it move before. Gathering my courage, I whispered, "Goodbye," but not in a friendly way, more of a good riddance kind of way. As we drove away from that block, I looked back at the building. From the street, the gargoyles were like specks, just tiny little offshoots of the architecture. But I knew what lurked there. It's been years. I've grown up, moved on, but those memories are something that a person just doesn't forget. I'll always remember the scraping claws on wooden floor, and the sound of that bird being snatched up and eaten alive by what was supposed to be a stone monument. I was only 8 years old. I never really had a chance to disbelieve the unexplained, because the most terrifying version of it was right outside my window. Do dinosaurs still exist? From Weird Things. I have lived in a small town surrounded by dense woods and rolling hills for most of my life. A very cozy little place where you know everybody, and the days are not very rushed. I'm a middle-aged guy, a school teacher. I love taking walks in the woods near my home, especially on rainy days when the trails are empty and the air is fresh. One afternoon, after a light rain had been falling for a few hours, I decided to go for a walk to clear my head. I grabbed my umbrella and set out toward a less traveled path that I'd been meaning to explore. The rain had softened to a drizzle, and a gentle mist hung between the trees. Everything was so quiet and subdued feeling. About half an hour in, I came upon this small, tranquil pond. I decided to take a short rest on a fallen log near the pond's edge. As I sat there, I began to notice movement on the opposite side. At first, I assumed a deer was about to emerge from the trees, but it moved differently, almost cautious. Squinting through the mist, I saw something step into the open, something that I could not believe was real. It stood about 3 feet tall on 2 strong hind legs, with a long tail that balanced its body. Its skin was covered in fine, scale-like feathers, mottled in earthy tones that blended seamlessly with the forest surroundings. The head was narrow, with keen eyes that seemed to survey the area intelligently. It reminded me of depictions I'd seen of small theropod dinosaurs, like a velociraptor, but more bird-like. I was frozen, both amazed and terrified that it might see me, because who knows what it might do if it did. The creature moved towards the pond, dipping its snout to drink. It hadn't noticed me yet, so I took the opportunity to observe it quietly. My mind was racing, though. Was this an undiscovered species? A bird or a reptile? I remembered my phone then. I reached for it slowly to grab it and take a picture, but as I shifted, the creature's head snapped up, and its eyes locked into mine. For a few tense seconds, we stared at each other. I didn't sense immediate danger, but there was a wildness in its gaze that kept me rooted to my spot, as if to say, "Don't you dare move or come any closer." Then, with a swift, fluid motion, it turned and darted back into the forest, disappearing among the trees without a sound. I quickly stood up and stared into the foliage, wondering if it was still out there watching me. I was questioning whether or not it really happened. I then decided it was probably best to head back before the weather worsened or I became a meal. The day after this, curiosity got the better of me. I returned to that clearing, hoping for another glimpse. The pond was still, and there was no sign of it. Not even any tracks. Over the following week, I began to hear unusual sounds during my walks. Calls that didn't match any local wildlife I was familiar with. They were sharp and high-pitched, like a chirp mixed with a raspy croak. I wondered if it was a new bird species, but the calls were very loud and seemed to be coming from something a bit larger. One afternoon, I came across a disturbing sight. Near the edge of the trail, I found the remains of a rabbit. It had been recently killed, but not in the way a fox or bird might leave it. There were deep gashes, and parts were missing entirely. A few days later, I found more evidence. Small animals like squirrels and birds, dead with similar wounds. A bit worried, I mentioned this to a neighbor who was an avid hunter. He shrugged it off, suggesting it was probably a coyote or a stray dog. But coyotes weren't common in that area, and the tracks I found near the carcasses didn't match up to them. Those eerie calls became more frequent, sometimes audible from my backyard at dusk. Others in town began to notice strange occurrences. A couple of pets acting anxious, livestock becoming restless. One evening, as I sat on my porch, I swear I saw movement at the tree line bordering my property. It was just a glimpse, a flash of that familiar mottled coloration slipping between the trees. I started to wonder if the creature was venturing closer to town. The idea unsettled me. While it hadn't shown aggression toward me during our encounter, the evidence of its hunting habits suggested it was a capable predator. A few nights later, I was awakened by the sound of something knocking over garbage cans in the alley behind my house. I peered out the window and saw a shadowy figure moving swiftly under the streetlights. It was low to the ground and moved with the same fluid gait I'd seen in the woods. Before I could get a better look, it vanished into the dark. The next morning, several neighbors reported similar disturbances. Trash bins overturned and gardens trampled. The town was abuzz with speculation, but no one could pinpoint the cause. I reported my own sightings to the local authorities. The sheriff listened politely but seemed skeptical, saying it was probably a stray dog or a raccoon, and that they would just keep an eye on it. The situation reached a tipping point when a farmer on the outskirts of town found several of his chickens dead. Their coop had been torn open. The community began to feel a palpable tension. And that's where we are now. I don't know what's going to happen next. Part of me is fascinated, drawn to the mystery of this thing, and I pray there's more information to come to light soon. But I do also hope that the strange disturbances stop. The people of this town deserve peace. And at the moment, it's getting a bit harder and harder to sleep. Thank you for tuning in to Unexplained Encounters. If you're not already, follow and listen to Unexplained Encounters on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or your favorite podcast app. Leave us a rating while you're at it. Get some cool creepy merch at eeriecast.store. Check out my other show where I narrate scary work stories. It's called Tales from the Break Room. For more terrifyingly entertaining shows from EerieCast, go to eeriecast.com. And if you want to listen to Unexplained Encounters and all the other EerieCast shows without pesky ads, sign up for EerieCast Plus at eeriecast.com/plus. You'll also get exclusive access to horror audiobooks only available to EerieCast Plus members. And you'll get 20% off our EerieCast.store merch through our members-only monthly discount code. Finally, if you have a scary story of the unexplained, send it to me at darkstories.org. I think that's about it. Thank you so much for joining us. Stay safe out there and stay creepy, because this world is a strange one.